We're continuing our study of the book of Revelation, and we've made our way now to chapter 1, verse 12. And verse 12 begins the vision that will carry through chapter 3. So this vision, specifically the remainder of chapter 1, which is verses 12 through 20, it follows the typical pattern of visions in the Old Testament and Jewish apocalyptic literature. And it's a very simple pattern. It consists of only 3 parts. There's the initial vision, which is verses 12 through 16, followed by the prophet's response, verse 17a, and then an interpretation of the vision, verse 17b through verse 20. And there are links to this back to, as I said, the Old Testament and Jewish apocalyptic literature. So when we get into those later verses, we'll be looking at the book of Daniel. But Beale makes an important point here at the start of this vision. And he says, quote, "The Old Testament allusions in this passage are essential to the meaning of both the vision and its interpretation. To de-emphasize their significance is to de-emphasize the interpretation of the text itself," end quote. Now, I agree with Beale on this. As some commentators and scholars believe that an overemphasis on John's sources will detract from the majesty of the vision. Now, I fully disagree with that. Without a detailed and thorough understanding of John's Old Testament sources, we cannot accurately understand the meaning of this vision. So what we're going to attempt to do is we're going to attempt to not underemphasize the Old Testament allusions, but we're going to attempt to actually go and dig out the Old Testament allusions and allow them to inform our understanding of the vision, because I believe that's what John intended. He's not just quoting and making all these Old Testament allusions for us to disregard the Old Testament places where he's getting these citations from. No, I think what he's doing is he's using the Old Testament, as we've mentioned before, in such a way to get us to go back and look at where he's drawing from, because it's the context of those passages that's going to inform us of the depth of the theology that's being communicated here. So let's get into it here. It's Revelation 1:12, and John writes, "And I turned to see the voice that spoke with me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands." So in this study, we're actually going to break this verse into 2 studies to keep them a little bit shorter. So in this study, we're going to be focusing on the first half of this verse, specifically where John says, "I turned to see the voice that spoke with me." Now, there's actually a lot of Old Testament allusions just in that phrase. So the first one, we're going to go through quite a number of these here. So the first one is Exodus chapter 20, verse 18. I'm going to read it out of Young's literal translation because, again, it's the literalness that John, I believe, is relying upon here. So Young's literal, Exodus 20:18 says, "And all the people are seeing the voices and the flames and the sound of the trumpet." And the Septuagint here says, "All the people are seeing the voice singular." Now I'm going to quote from David Aune in a little bit later, and David Aune actually says that the Masoretic text says the people are seeing the voice. So David Aune obviously knows how to research these things much more than I do. But when I tried to look into it, it looked to me like the Masoretic had voices in the plural here. So whether the Masoretic has plural voices or we go with the Septuagint singular voice, the emphasis here is on the fact that it says the people are seeing the voice or the voices. And this is commented on by Moses in Deuteronomy 4, verse 12. And there it says, "Then Yahweh spoke to you from the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but you saw no form, only a voice." So what's Moses saying there? I think he's commenting back on Exodus 20, verse 18, where it says the people are seeing the voice, and Moses says, "You saw no form, only a voice." So this idea of seeing a voice is very interesting. And it's commented on, it's noticed by the rabbis, and it's noticed by modern day scholars as well. So Greg Beale says, quote, In the light of the allusion to Exodus 19, 16, and 19 in Revelation 1, 10, and 11, and let me just comment here briefly, let me break in here. Exodus 19, 16, and 19 is when God answered Moses with a voice. So Beale says that the awkward seeing of a voice in 1:12 is best seen as a continuation of the Exodus allusion. And Philo underscores the visibility of the voice in Exodus 19, 16 through 19. And in Ezekiel 3, 12 through 13 in the Septuagint, which probably alludes to Exodus 20 and has been alluded to in Revelation 1:10, the prophet says, "The Spirit took me up, and I heard behind me the voice of a great earthquake, and I beheld the voice of the wings of the four living creatures." End quote. That's the end of Beale's quotation there. And Beale also, he links this to Ezekiel 43 verse 6 in the Septuagint. So I'm going to read that. Ezekiel 43, 6 in the Septuagint says, "And I stood, and behold, a voice out of the house of one speaking to me." So if you'll remember in our introductory episodes, I mentioned that there are scholars who make a big deal about how often John alludes to Ezekiel. And so this is one of those places here. There's quite a few Ezekiel verses that I have here that talk about this voice. So there's another odd one, and it's Ezekiel chapter 1, and it's verse 24 through 28. So I'm going to read that passage. I'm not going to read verse 27. I'm going to specifically read verses 24 through 26 and then verse 28. And this is an English translation out of the Septuagint. And it says, Ezekiel says, "And I heard the sound of their wings when they went, as the sound of much water. And when they stood, their wings were let down. And lo, a voice from above the firmament that was over their head. There was as the appearance of a sapphire stone, and the likeness of a throne upon it. And upon the likeness of the throne was the likeness as an appearance of a man above. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And I saw and fell upon my face and heard the voice of one speaking." So notice in verse 25, there is no mention of Ezekiel hearing the voice. He sees the voice. So did you notice that in verse 25? It said, "And lo, a voice from above the firmament." It doesn't say anything about him hearing a voice above the firmament. He just says, lo, like behold. Behold a voice from above the firmament. It seems like he sees the voice. And then the voice, is the likeness of Yahweh's glory. Now, he does hear the voice in verse 28, but in verse 25 it seems that he sees it. And Moshe Greenberg, a famous Ezekiel scholar, he wrote the Ezekiel commentary in the Anchor Bible series. He notices this and he says, quote, "The expression avoids ascribing the speech directly to the human figure visible on the throne in the apparition, as though reserving the source of the speech for the unseen God," end quote. So Greenberg there, what he's saying is he's making a distinction between the likeness of Yahweh's glory, which is appearing in human form, and this voice. As Greenberg says, it appears that the voice is reserved for the unseen God, not the human, not the one that looks like a human, who is the likeness of Yahweh's glory. So then my thought was, should we connect this to the transfiguration? When Jesus is there, and then you have the voice which speaks out of the cloud. So the cloud would have been something visible, and Jesus is obviously visible, and then the voice. So that's just a thought I have. None of the scholars link the voice or this passage in Ezekiel to the transfiguration, but that was one of my thoughts. And David Aune has a fairly lengthy entry on this idea of seeing a voice, and I'm going to read just a small snippet of it. Aune says, quote, "How is it possible to see a voice? The Masoretic of Exodus 20:18 reads, 'And all the people saw the voice.' The peculiarity of the Septuagint of Exodus 20:18 is commented on by Philo, who refers to commands which God, without a prophet, proclaimed through a voice, which, paradoxically, was visible." Now, Philo further discusses the meaning of the paradoxical expression in Exodus 20, verse 18, And he, Philo, quotes two other related passages. The first one is the Septuagint of Exodus 20, verse 22, which says, "You have seen that I spoke to you from heaven." So let me break in here. That's kind of curious. You have seen that I spoke to you. And then Aune continues here, and he's quoting Philo. He says, and the Septuagint of Deuteronomy 4:12, "And you did not see an image, but a voice." And traces of rabbinic speculation on Exodus 20:18 are also found, where the rabbis say, quote, "Normally it is impossible to see sound, but here the people did," end quote. And that's also the end of Aune, of the section I'm going to read of Aune. Now it's really interesting. I saw in one academic article the author who was going through this idea of the voice. And he was more of what I would call like a text critical scholar. So he didn't have a problem with the idea of the Torah being composed of various sources and pieces and things of that sort. I'm not sure exactly what his view was on whether it was the documentary type idea or just a different idea, but he suggested the idea, and I thought it was interesting, that if you put Exodus 19:19 and 20:18 together, it comes out with something very interesting. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should cut the Bible into snippets and paste them like that, but it's just interesting as a kind of as just a thought exercise for what we're talking about here. So Exodus 19:19 put back to back with 20:18, it would read, "Moses spoke, and God answered him by a voice, and the entire people saw the voice." I thought that was really interesting, just a suggestion. So now this brings us, this idea of the voice, and connecting it with Revelation, it brings us to the book of Numbers. And it just fascinates me again how many different Old Testament allusions John is drawing upon with just single phrases in the way that he's composed Revelation. But specifically, we're going to be looking at Numbers 7, verse 89. And a lot of English Bibles have little subheaders over specific sections. And I was looking at the New American Bible Revised Edition, and the little header that they have over this verse, it just reads, "The Voice." So their subheader is "The Voice," and then they give number 789, which says, "When Moses entered the tent of meeting to speak with God." Now, literally, the Hebrew there reads "him." So a more literal translation would say, "When Moses entered the tent of meeting to speak with him, he heard the voice addressing him from above the cover on the Ark of the Covenant from between the two cherubim, and so it spoke to him." Now, there's a rabbinic writing known as Sifrei Numbers. And in that, the rabbis are commenting on this passage in Numbers 789, and they say, quote, "Scripture relates that Moses would enter into the tent of meeting and stand there, and the voice descended from highest heavens to between the cherubs, and he heard the voice speaking to him from within," end quote. So you might still be wondering, what's the point? All right, we've gone through a lot of verses and a lot of quotes about this idea of seeing a voice. So you might be thinking, well, who cares? What's the point? Like, what's the punchline? Why are we going through this? Well, a fascinating section I saw in Andrei Orlov's pretty recent book. It's 3 or 4 years old now, and the title is "The Glory of the Invisible God: Two Powers in Heaven Traditions and Early Christology." And Orlov, I'm going to read a little section of this here. He has a very interesting comment here about this voice. And he says, quote, "Another important connection found in both Christian and rabbinic accounts is that the first power is no longer rendered according to its normative visual aesthetics, namely as a manifestation of the divine glory, but instead as the oral expression, the divine voice." So let me break in here and comment on that. As Orlov writes in pretty high English, it can be, he doesn't write he doesn't write in very common vernacular. So what he's saying here in this first section is that when you look at later rabbinic and Christian writings about this idea of two powers, he's saying that the way that they convey the first power in heaven is not with a visible, not with visible commentary, but he's saying that how they portray the first power is through this idea of the divine voice. And Orloff continues, quote, "This transferal is not coincidental, since the withdrawal of the first power into the oral invisible mode frees the symbolic space for the theophonic apotheosis of the second power." Now let me break in here again, as that's more very scholarly language. So what he's saying is that by communicating the idea of the first power as a voice rather than something visible, what the rabbis and the Christian authors have done is that they have made way for the second power to be described using visible terminology. So one more little section out of Orlov. He says, quote, "Often scholars fail to note that in both corpora," and by corpora he's talking about the rabbinic and the Christian writings. So he says, again, "Often scholars fail to note that in both corpora the two powers are portrayed in a similar way, appearing in two theophonic modes. The manifestation of the first is portrayed as an epiphany of the aniconic voice, while the second appears as the celestial form, frequently bearing attributes of the divine glory," end quote. So if you're familiar with Dr. Heiser, Michael Heiser, he communicated a similar idea. He never, as far as I know, talked about the voice, but he would say, when talking about the two powers, he would say that there's Yahweh invisible in heaven, and there's Yahweh who at times appears visibly in human form on earth. That's the same thing that Orlov is talking about here, except he is saying that the first power, who Dr. Heiser referred to as Yahweh invisible in heaven, Andrei Orlov is saying that that first power is the aniconic, meaning invisible, not represented by an icon, by something you can see. But he refers to it as the voice, the divine voice. And then the second power is frequently described again in human form as the likeness of the divine glory, the glory of Yahweh, Yahweh's glory. Okay, so if we put this all together, what do we see? So John, he turns around to see the voice, who, according to Dr. Orlov, is the first power in heaven. Okay, but what does he actually see? What we find out when we get to verse 13 is that what he sees when he turns around to see the voice is that he sees one like a son of man. And then in verse 14, this one like a son of man is identified as the Ancient of Days. And then this one like the Son of Man, who's identified of the Ancient of Days, is identified as Jesus in verse 18. So starting right here in verse 12, John is weaving together the two powers theology. And we'll be discussing the two powers in heaven at length in an upcoming study. And I'm actually considering doing a sub-study just of the two powers in heaven after we get through with chapter 1. But the two powers will be heavily emphasized in our study of verse 13 and 14, because that's what John is doing. He's describing Jesus using Ancient of Days language from Daniel chapter 7. But this idea of the two powers, it begins right here in verse 12. John starts his tour de force, his very high emphasis on the deity of Christ, by citing Exodus chapter 20, in which God speaks and the people saw the voice. Now this is confirmed again by Deuteronomy 4:12, and the same idea is found throughout Ezekiel. And so John is taking this idea out of the Old Testament, which in God, again, God speaks, people saw the voice, and the voice of Jesus is the voice of God, because that's who John sees when he turns around. And we'll see this again in verse 15, when again this idea of the voice is brought up, and it's clearly the voice of Christ. Going further, what do we see here? How do we understand this? Well, if you remember how Jesus would at times say to the Pharisees, he would say, "I and the Father are one." And the response of the Pharisees would be to try to stone him. Now, why would they respond that way? Well, because Jesus was identifying himself and the Father as the two powers in heaven. And John is using the titles the titles and the descriptors of both powers interchangeably. He's describing Jesus with the terminology of the first power and the second power. You can't divide the Godhead. As Jesus said, I and the Father are one. And we're seeing evidence of that here, and I think it's very, very interesting. So, I want to read a little bit further to set us up for the second part of our study of verse 12. And that's going to be investigating the lampstands. Because if we go back to Numbers 7:89, and then we read the first two verses of chapter 8, it's interesting. So, upon hearing the voice and turning to see him, we'll see what does John first see? He will see one like a son of man. But first, he sees 7 gold lampstands. So I think that links back again to Numbers 7, verse 89 through chapter 8, verse 2. It says, when Moses went into the tent of meeting to speak with him, he would hear the voice speaking to him from above the cover that was on the Ark of the Covenant from between the 2 cherubim. Thus it spoke to him. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and say, when you set up the menorah lamps, have the 7 lamps throw their light in front of the menorah. So notice again there, verse 89, Moses would hear the voice speaking to him, and then who's speaking? Yahweh. So the voice is Yahweh, and Yahweh is the voice. And Jesus is Yahweh incarnate. He's the God of Israel incarnate. So when John turns to see the voice, who does he see? Jesus. Again, the 2 powers, I and the Father are one. It's interchangeable. They're interchangeably described. It's the deity of Christ. And again, as we said at the start, if we were to de-emphasize the Old Testament allusions, we wouldn't see any of that. We would just think that John is speaking metaphorically about turning around to see a voice. And that's what some scholars do. They, the voice is just a figure of speech for the one who's speaking. Well, if we de-emphasize all of this Old Testament, that's what we would be left with. We'd be left with he's just turning around to see who's speaking because the voice is a figure of speech. And we would lose all of this incredible detail and the incredible theological significance of what's being communicated. And we'll see the same thing when we get to verse 14 with the Ancient of Days. If we don't go back to Daniel and figure out where those terms come from, we're not going to understand what John's saying. So just as a closing thought, parting thought here, could we or should we connect the voice to the word, the logos? If so, that would be another blending of the 2 powers in heaven. That's something I'm still thinking about, so I'll just leave that as a parting thought for everyone out there. And we will continue, I will finish up verse 12 in our next study. I hope you find this as fascinating as I do. The 2 powers in heaven is a fascinating area of study to me. And I just remember when I first came across it through Dr. Heiser, listening to multiple of his lectures to try to wrap my mind around it. And then doing the study of Revelation here, it was more clear to me in verses 13 and 14. I was not expecting to find it in verse 12 with this idea of the voice. Then when I saw Andrei Orlov describe the first power as the voice, I thought that was just absolutely fascinating. And then when Jesus is the one who John sees when he turns to see the voice, it's the deity of Christ is being communicated very clearly and very strongly in Revelation chapter 1. But again, without the Old Testament, we really would not know that. So, thank you all for listening. God bless. I'll talk to you all very soon.